Deep in the hollow country of West Virginia, where the morning mist clings to mountainsides like restless spirits, there lived a family whose very name made grown men cross themselves and children hurry past their property after dark. The Hatfields weren't just another clan scratching out a living from the unforgiving Appalachian soil. They were something far more sinister, bound by blood oaths and ancient traditions that predated any church or courthouse in those mountains. When settlers first whispered about the Hatfield family in the 1820s, they spoke not of their farming or their hunting, but of the strange ceremonies that echoed through Devil's Creek on moonless nights. They talked about livestock found drained of blood, arranged in perfect circles near the family's sprawling compound. They whispered about travelers who vanished along the mountain passes that bordered Hatfield territory, leaving behind only personal belongings arranged in deliberate patterns that no Christian soul could interpret. The patriarch of this cursed bloodline was Ephraim Hatfield, a man whose piercing gray eyes seemed to look straight through to your soul's darkest corners. Standing nearly 7 feet tall, with hands that could crush a man's windpipe without effort, Ephraim commanded respect through a combination of raw terror and supernatural reputation. Local folklore claimed he could speak to the dead, that he'd made bargains with entities that dwelt in the deepest cave systems beneath his mountain stronghold. But the true horror of the Hatfield legacy wasn't just one man's descent into darkness. It was how that darkness spread through bloodlines, like a hereditary curse, passing from father to son, mother to daughter, creating generations of individuals who seemed to exist outside the moral boundaries that governed decent folk. The family's compound sat on nearly 3,000 acres of the most forbidding terrain in Logan County. Visitors who were brave enough or foolish enough to venture onto Hatfield land described a place where nature itself seemed corrupted. Trees grew in unnatural spirals, their bark blackened as though by perpetual fire. Springs that should have run clear instead bubbled up dark water that left metallic stains on everything it touched. Even the wildlife avoided the area, creating an eerie silence that pressed against your eardrums like a physical weight. The Hatfield children, numbering in the dozens across multiple wives and generations, displayed peculiarities that marked them as different from birth. They were born with unusually pale skin that seemed to glow faintly in moonlight, with eyes that reflected light like nocturnal predators. More disturbing was their uncanny ability to move through the dense mountain forests without making a sound, appearing and disappearing like shadows given form. Local records, what few existed in those lawless times, painted a picture of a family that operated by their own brutal code. When the Hatfields felt wronged, they didn't seek justice through courts or sheriffs. They dispensed their own punishment, often in ways that left victims wishing for a quick death instead of the prolonged torment that became the family's signature. The most chilling accounts came from those few souls who'd witnessed Hatfield justice firsthand and lived to tell about it. They described ritualistic punishments carried out in a natural amphitheater deep within the family's territory, where victims would be subjected to psychological torments designed to break their minds before their bodies. The Hatfields believed that a person's final moments of terror and pain could be harvested, concentrated, and used to strengthen their own supernatural abilities. These weren't random acts of violence, born from mountain feuds or economic desperation. The Hatfield family's brutality followed specific patterns, timed to lunar cycles and seasonal changes that suggested a deeper, more organized purpose behind their actions. They kept detailed records in leather-bound journals written in a mixture of English and symbols that resembled no known language, documenting their victims' final words, the exact duration of their suffering, and the atmospheric conditions during each ritualistic murder. The family's reputation for supernatural power wasn't merely superstition born from isolated mountain communities. Too many witnesses reported incidents that defied rational explanation. Ephraim Hatfield could allegedly predict deaths weeks before they occurred, describing in precise detail how his enemies would meet their end. Family members seemed immune to diseases that devastated neighboring settlements, and they demonstrated an uncanny ability to find lost travelers in the vast wilderness, often arriving at the exact moment when hope had abandoned the lost souls. More unsettling were the accounts of the Hatfield family's apparent ability to influence the thoughts and actions of others. Visitors to their territory reported experiencing overwhelming urges to confess their deepest secrets, to reveal information they'd never intended to share. Some claimed that after encountering the Hatfields, they found themselves committing acts completely contrary to their moral nature, as though their will had been temporarily subjugated to some external force. The family's economic activities provided a legitimate front for their darker pursuits. They controlled extensive logging operations, using their reputation for violence to secure the most profitable timber contracts in the region. Other families, even those with superior equipment and larger workforces, found themselves unable to compete when their machinery mysteriously malfunctioned or their workers suffered accidents that always seemed to occur when Hatfield territory was nearby. Their moonshine operation, run through a network of hidden stills scattered throughout their mountain domain, produced liquor that was rumored to have unusual properties. Those who drank Hatfield whiskey reported experiencing vivid hallucinations, temporary loss of memory, and in some cases, permanent changes to their personality. The family used this potent brew not just for profit, but as a tool for controlling and manipulating those who opposed them. The Hatfield women were perhaps even more terrifying than their male counterparts. While the men relied on physical intimidation and overt violence, the women specialized in psychological warfare and what locals called root work, a twisted form of folk magic that combined traditional Appalachian herbalism with far darker practices. They were known to create powders and potions that could induce madness, blindness, or slow, agonizing death in their victims. Martha Hatfield, Ephraim's primary wife, was said to have mastered the art of dream invasion. Victims reported that she could enter their sleeping minds, subjecting them to nightmares so vivid and terrifying that many never fully recovered their sanity. She would appear in these dreams not as herself, but as a constantly shifting entity that took the form of the dreamer's deepest fears. The younger Hatfield women were trained from childhood in the family's dark arts. They learned to read the signs written in animal entrails, to interpret the patterns formed by scattered bones, and to communicate with the restless spirits that were said to gather in great numbers around the family's burial grounds. These burial grounds themselves were a source of local terror, as they contained not just Hatfield ancestors, but also the remains of countless victims whose disappearances had been attributed to the family's vengeance. What made the Hatfield family particularly dangerous was their strategic intelligence. Unlike other mountain clans, who relied solely on intimidation and violence, the Hatfields understood the importance of maintaining relationships with corrupt officials and businessmen who could provide them with advance warning of legal troubles or competing interests. They had judges, sheriffs, and even federal marshals on their payroll, ensuring that investigations into their activities would be quietly abandoned or misdirected. The family's influence extended far beyond their mountain stronghold. They maintained safe houses and loyal contacts throughout West Virginia, Kentucky, and Virginia, creating a network that allowed them to strike at enemies hundreds of miles away from their home territory. When someone crossed the Hatfields, geography provided no protection. Victims might flee to distant cities, only to find that the family's reach had preceded them. Their most terrifying capability was their apparent ability to turn family members against each other. The Hatfields seemed to possess an intuitive understanding of human psychology, able to identify and exploit the hidden resentments and jealousies that existed within their enemies' families. They would carefully plant seeds of suspicion and doubt, then watch as their victims destroyed themselves from within. The children of the Hatfield family were raised in an environment where violence and cruelty were not just accepted, but celebrated as signs of strength and intelligence. They were taught that ordinary people were essentially livestock, existing only to serve the family's needs and desires. This indoctrination created individuals who could commit the most heinous acts without experiencing guilt or remorse. By the time the younger Hatfields reached adulthood, they had been shaped into perfect instruments of their family's dark will. They combined the physical capabilities of their mountain upbringing with a sophisticated understanding of human nature and an absolute absence of moral restraint. They were equally comfortable tracking a victim through miles of wilderness or manipulating a business rival through careful psychological pressure. The family's legacy of terror was carefully documented and preserved, passed down through generations like a twisted form of oral history. Each new generation was taught not just the techniques of violence and intimidation, but also the deeper philosophy that justified their actions. They believed themselves to be the inheritors of an ancient power, chosen to rule over lesser beings through whatever means necessary. The Hatfield compound itself was designed to reflect and amplify the family's supernatural reputation. The main house, built from logs so dark they seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, contained rooms that served purposes no civilized person could imagine. There were chambers designed for interrogation and torture, with walls that had been treated with substances that prevented sound from escaping. There were rooms where the family conducted their occult practices, filled with artifacts and symbols that seemed to pulse with malevolent energy. The most feared location on the property was known as the confession room, where the Hatfields would bring those who had crossed them for final judgment. This chamber was constructed with acoustic properties that amplified whispers into screams and made normal conversation impossible. As the winter of 1887 settled over Devilance Hatfield's mountain stronghold, the family's true nature began to manifest in ways that would cement their reputation as something far more sinister than mere feuding mountaineers. The cold months had always been when the Hatfields conducted their most sacred and terrible work, when the veil between worlds grew thin and their ancient pacts demanded renewed attention. The compound itself seemed to pulse with malevolent energy during these dark months. The very ground beneath their feet held secrets that would make even the most hardened federal marshal flee in terror. Beneath the main cabin, accessible only through a hidden entrance behind the stone hearth, lay a network of chambers carved from living rock. These weren't mere root cellars or storage spaces. They were sanctuaries of darkness where the Hatfields practiced rituals that predated any Christian influence in the mountains. The centerpiece of this subterranean complex was what family members called the blood chamber. Here, the walls were lined with human skulls, each one carefully selected from enemies who had crossed the family over the decades. But these weren't trophies in any conventional sense. According to the whispered accounts of those few who had glimpsed this hellish space, each skull served as a vessel, a conduit through which the Hatfields could commune with the spirits of their victims. Devil Anse himself was no mere patriarch of a feuding clan. Those who observed him closely spoke of his supernatural abilities with hushed terror. He possessed an uncanny knowledge of events occurring miles away, often predicting the movements of law enforcement or rival families with impossible accuracy. His pale eyes seemed to see through flesh and bone, reading the deepest fears and secrets of anyone who dared meet his gaze. More disturbing still were the reports from his own family members that he never seemed to age, his appearance remaining unchanged even as his children grew to adulthood. The Hatfield children were raised in an atmosphere of ritualized violence that went far beyond simple mountain justice. From the earliest age, they were taught that blood was the currency of power, that pain was the language of control, and that death was merely another tool in their arsenal. The family maintained a strict hierarchy based not on age or gender, but on one's capacity for cruelty and supernatural sensitivity. Young Hatfields underwent initiation rites that would have horrified even the most hardened criminals of their era. On their 13th birthday, each child was taken to the blood chamber and forced to participate in what the family called the awakening. The specific details of this ritual were known only to blood family members, but those who survived the process emerged fundamentally changed. Their eyes took on the same predatory gleam as their elders. Their movements became unnaturally fluid, and they developed an instinctive understanding of human weakness that allowed them to manipulate others with terrifying efficiency. The famous feud with the McCoys was merely the public face of a much darker campaign of terror. While newspapers reported on the surface conflicts over stolen pigs and forbidden romances, the true war being waged was spiritual in nature. The Hatfields viewed the McCoys not as rival mountaineers, but as obstacles to their supernatural dominion over the region. Each killing was carefully planned, not just for strategic advantage, but for its ritual significance. The New Year's Night Massacre of 1888, where Hatfield gunmen surrounded the McCoy cabin and set it ablaze, was far more than a simple act of vengeance. The timing was deliberate, chosen to coincide with ancient observances that the family had maintained for generations. As the cabin burned and the McCoy family fled into the night, The Hatfields didn't simply gun them down. They herded them toward specific locations, forcing them to die in patterns that formed occult symbols visible only from the surrounding ridges. The blood spilled that night wasn't allowed to soak into the earth naturally. Instead, Hatfield family members collected it in specially prepared vessels, carrying it back to their compound where it would be incorporated into their most sacred rituals. The screams of the dying weren't just sounds of human suffering, but were believed by the family to carry spiritual power that could be harvested and stored for future use. What made the Hatfields truly terrifying wasn't just their capacity for violence, but their systematic approach to psychological warfare. They understood that fear was more powerful than bullets, that a reputation for supernatural abilities could accomplish what armies could not. They carefully cultivated stories about their otherworldly powers, ensuring that each tale grew more elaborate with each telling. Travelers through Hatfield territory reported encounters that defied rational explanation. Compasses would spin wildly when pointed toward the family compound. Horses would refuse to cross certain streams, no matter how their riders urged them forward. Most disturbing were the accounts of voices heard in the wind, speaking in languages that predated European settlement, calling out warnings to those who ventured too close to forbidden ground. The family's moonshine operation served purposes beyond mere profit. The whiskey they produced was infused with herbs and other substances that created powerful psychological effects in those who consumed it. Regular customers reported vivid dreams where they received detailed instructions about how to serve Hatfield interests. Some claimed they found themselves performing tasks they had no memory of agreeing to, waking up miles from home with no recollection of how they had arrived there. Local law enforcement learned quickly that investigating Hatfield activities was a career-ending endeavor at best. Deputies who ventured too close to the compound either disappeared entirely or returned as hollow-eyed shells of their former selves, refusing to discuss what they had witnessed. The few who attempted to describe their experiences spoke of chambers beneath the earth, where impossible geometries defied comprehension, where the walls themselves seemed to breathe and whisper secrets in forgotten tongues. The family maintained an extensive network of informants throughout the region, but these weren't merely paid spies. Through a combination of supernatural influence and carefully administered psychological conditioning, they had created a web of unwilling servants who reported back without conscious awareness of their betrayal. Shopkeepers, postal workers, even ministers found themselves compelled to share information about anyone who showed interest in Hatfield activities. As federal attention began to focus on the region, the family's response revealed the true depth of their power. Rather than fleeing or preparing for conventional warfare, they began what they called the Great Working, a ritual of such magnitude that it would permanently alter the spiritual landscape of the mountains. For 13 nights, beginning with the winter solstice, the entire family gathered in the blood chamber to perform ceremonies that had been passed down through generations of their lineage. The effects of this working were felt throughout the region. Livestock began dying in patterns that formed geometric shapes when viewed from above. Springs that had flowed for centuries suddenly ran dry, while new water sources appeared in places where geological surveys indicated they shouldn't exist. Most disturbing were the reports from multiple witnesses of strange lights moving through the mountains at night, following paths that corresponded to no known trails or roads. By the time federal marshals arrived in force, they found a region transformed. The Hatfield compound appeared to be nothing more than a collection of modest mountain cabins, but those with sensitive natures reported an overwhelming sense of wrongness that made extended observation impossible. Equipment malfunctioned without explanation. Photographs came out distorted, showing shadows where none should exist, and revealing details that the naked eye couldn't perceive. The marshals who attempted to arrest Devil Ants reported that he seemed to know they were coming days before they arrived. When they finally confronted him, he appeared completely unconcerned, as though he possessed knowledge that rendered their legal authority meaningless. Some witnesses claimed that during the attempted arrest, the temperature dropped noticeably, and several of the lawmen began experiencing symptoms resembling hypothermia despite the moderate weather. The eventual resolution of the feud through legal channels was, according to those who understood the family's true nature, merely a tactical withdrawal. The Hatfields had achieved their primary objective of establishing spiritual dominion over their territory. The public attention served their purposes by spreading their reputation far beyond the mountains, creating a network of fear that extended their influence across multiple states. In the years following the supposed end of the feud, the Hatfield family's power only grew more subtle and more pervasive. They diversified their operations, moving beyond simple moonshining and logging into more sophisticated enterprises that allowed them to influence political and economic developments throughout Appalachia. Their descendants learned to wear the masks of respectability while maintaining the ancient traditions that had made their ancestors so feared. The legacy of terror established during those dark winter months of 1887 would echo through generations, creating a blueprint for supernatural influence that other mountain families would attempt to emulate but never fully master. The blood chamber remained active throughout the 1890s, its stone altar now permanently stained black from decades of ritual sacrifice. But as the new century approached, the Hatfield clan began to evolve their methods, adapting ancient practices to an increasingly connected world. The arrival of the railroad in 1899 brought new opportunities and new threats to their mountain stronghold. Ephraim Hatfield, now in his 70s but appearing decades younger due to the dark pacts that sustained him, recognized that pure isolation would no longer protect his family's secrets. The modern world was encroaching, and the clan needed to infiltrate it rather than hide from it. This marked the beginning of what locals would later whisper about as the Hatfield expansion, a calculated campaign to spread their influence far beyond the misty hollers of West Virginia. The first phase involved strategic marriages and business partnerships. Hatfield children, trained from birth in the arts of manipulation and blessed with supernatural charisma, began courting the sons and daughters of prominent families across the region. These weren't unions born of love, but calculated alliances designed to embed Hatfield influence into the power structures of multiple states. Each bride or groom who married into an outside family carried with them small vials of water from the cursed springs that ran beneath the Hatfield compound. This water, when consumed regularly by their new spouses, created a subtle form of mental bondage, ensuring loyalty while appearing to be nothing more than a regional health tonic. Rebecca Hatfield, Ephraim's eldest daughter, exemplified this strategy when she married Judge Thomas Blackwood of Charleston in 1902. Within months of their wedding, Judge Blackwood's legal decisions began favoring cases that mysteriously benefited Hatfield interests. His personality shifted subtly, becoming more authoritarian and secretive. Court records from this period show an unusual pattern of dismissed cases and sealed documents, particularly those involving land disputes, in areas where the Hatfields were quietly acquiring property. The second phase involved the establishment of legitimate businesses that served as fronts for darker activities. The Hatfield Timber Company expanded beyond simple logging operations, becoming one of the largest lumber distributors in the eastern United States. Their success defied economic logic, as their crews could fell trees in half the time of competitors, and their lumber was prized for its unusual durability and resistance to decay. What buyers didn't know was that each shipment was blessed in midnight ceremonies, where family members would walk among the stacked logs, whispering incantations in the ancient language their patriarch had learned in the blood chamber decades earlier. These rituals weren't merely superstitious practices. Customers who used Hatfield lumber in construction projects reported strange phenomena in their buildings. Residents spoke of voices echoing through the walls during storms, of shadows that moved independently of light sources, and of an inexplicable sense of being watched. Most disturbing were the reports of enhanced healing properties. Buildings constructed with Hatfield lumber seemed to accelerate the recovery of sick occupants, but this healing came with a price. Those who recovered from illnesses in Hatfield lumber buildings often developed an obsessive loyalty to the family, becoming unwitting agents who would report on local activities and follow subtle suggestions planted during their recovery. The Hatfield mining operations underwent similar expansion during this period. Coal extracted from their tunnels burned hotter and longer than standard coal, making it highly sought after by steel mills and railroad companies. The secret lay in the ritual chambers that Ephraim had constructed deep within each mine shaft. These underground sanctuaries, carved directly into the living rock, served as focal points for ceremonies that infused the coal with supernatural properties. Workers who spent extended periods in these mines developed enhanced night vision and an uncanny ability to sense impending cave-ins, but they also began exhibiting signs of spiritual corruption. Their eyes would reflect light like those of nocturnal animals, and they spoke in their sleep using words from the ancient language that seemed to emanate from the depths of the earth itself. The psychological impact of working in Hatfield mines was profound. Miners reported shared dreams of vast underground cities populated by shadowy figures who beckoned them deeper into the earth. Some workers disappeared entirely, vanishing into the maze of tunnels despite extensive search efforts. Those who were found days later emerged changed, speaking of revelations received in the darkness and bearing strange symbols carved into their flesh that they claimed to have no memory of creating. The Hatfield moonshine operation also evolved during this period, becoming a sophisticated distribution network that reached major cities along the eastern seaboard. But their liquor was far more than simple alcohol. Each batch was distilled using water from the cursed springs and aged in barrels that had been blessed in the blood chamber. The resulting spirits possessed mild psychoactive properties that enhanced suggestibility and created subtle addictive patterns. Regular consumers of Hatfield moonshine found themselves increasingly susceptible to influence and prone to violent outbursts that served the family's interests. Tavern owners who served Hatfield spirits reported that their establishments became gathering places for individuals with questionable loyalties and violent tendencies. Bar fights would break out with unusual frequency, but the participants would often have no clear memory of what triggered the violence. More concerning were the reports of coordinated criminal activities among regular patrons, as if the moonshine was creating informal networks of individuals who could be activated for specific purposes without their conscious awareness. The family's influence began extending into political circles through a combination of blackmail, bribery, and supernatural coercion. Hatfield agents, many of whom were the products of strategic marriages or individuals corrupted through exposure to their various products, began occupying positions in law enforcement, local government, and even state legislatures. These agents weren't always aware of their true allegiances. Many believed they were simply successful individuals who happened to find themselves in positions of power. Sheriff Marcus Whitmore of Logan County exemplified this pattern. After consuming Hatfield moonshine regularly for several months, he began experiencing vivid dreams in which a figure resembling Ephraim Hatfield would provide guidance on law enforcement matters. Following these dreams, Whitmore would make decisions that invariably benefited Hatfield interests, dismissing investigations into their activities and providing advance warning of federal raids. When questioned about his choices, Whitmore would become agitated and defensive, insisting that his decisions were based purely on professional judgment. The supernatural aspects of Hatfield influence became more sophisticated during this period. Family members developed abilities that went beyond their original gifts, learning to project their consciousness across vast distances and influence the thoughts of individuals they had never met in person. This remote manipulation was accomplished through a network of consecrated objects, small items blessed in the blood chamber and distributed throughout their territory. These objects, which appeared to be simple jewelry, coins, or household items, served as spiritual anchors that allowed the Hatfields to extend their influence far beyond their physical presence. Documentation from this era becomes increasingly difficult to verify as the Hatfield influence on record keeping grew more pervasive. Court documents disappeared, newspaper articles were altered or retracted, and official investigations were quietly abandoned. The few records that survived hint at a level of organization and supernatural capability that challenges conventional understanding of what a single family could accomplish. Her writings, discovered decades later in a sealed vault, describe patients who exhibited signs of spiritual possession after consuming Hatfield products or visiting Hatfield-controlled territories. These individuals would experience personality changes, develop unusual physical capabilities, and demonstrate knowledge they couldn't possibly possess. Most disturbing were her accounts of group sessions where multiple affected individuals would speak simultaneously in the ancient language, their voices harmonizing in patterns that suggested coordination by an external intelligence. The economic impact of Hatfield expansion during this period was staggering. Their legitimate businesses generated enormous profits, but more importantly, they created dependencies that made entire communities beholden to their interests. Towns that relied on Hatfield industries found themselves unable to function without the family's continued presence. When the Hatfields withdrew their support from a community, businesses would fail, crops would wither, and residents would experience a collective psychological decline that often resulted in mass migration. The town of Millbrook, West Virginia, serves as a cautionary example of Hatfield economic manipulation. After a brief period of prosperity following the establishment of a Hatfield lumber mill, the community became entirely dependent on the family's operations. When local leaders attempted to investigate reports of strange activities at the mill, the Hatfields simply ceased operations and relocated their equipment overnight. Within months, Millbrook had become a ghost town, its residents either following the Hatfields to their new location or abandoning the area entirely due to a series of inexplicable misfortunes that befell anyone who remained. The children born into the Hatfield clan during this expansion period represented a new generation of supernatural entities. Unlike their predecessors, who had developed their abilities through ritual and exposure to corrupted influences, these children were born with capabilities that defied natural explanation. They could communicate telepathically with family members across vast distances, manipulate the emotions of others through direct eye contact, and demonstrate an intuitive understanding of complex business and political strategies despite their youth. Young Samuel Hatfield, born in 1895, exemplified these enhanced abilities. By age 10, he could predict market fluctuations with uncanny accuracy, allowing the family to make profitable investments that appeared to be based on impossible prescience. He also demonstrated the ability to heal injuries through touch, but his healing came with a disturbing side effect. Those he healed would develop an obsessive devotion to the Hatfield family, abandoning their previous loyalties and dedicating their lives to advancing Hatfield interests. The educational systems in Hatfield-controlled territories began reflecting the family's influence during this period. Schools in these areas started incorporating unusual curriculum elements, teaching local history that portrayed the Hatfields as benevolent leaders and introducing children to concepts that prepared them for eventual recruitment into the family's operations. Teachers reported that students from Hatfield influenced families, demonstrated advanced learning capabilities, but also exhibited concerning behavioral patterns, including a tendency toward violence against those who questioned established authority and an unusual interest in occult subjects. The religious institutions in Hatfield territories underwent similar transformation. Ministers who had initially opposed the family's practices found themselves delivering sermons that incorporated elements of the ancient beliefs that the Hatfields promoted. Church services began including rituals that appeared to be Christian but contained subtle elements drawn from the ceremonies performed in the blood chamber. Congregants reported profound spiritual experiences during these services, but also described disturbing dreams and an increasing acceptance of violence as a legitimate tool for advancing righteous causes. The Hatfield influence on regional folklore during this period created a mythology that served their purposes while concealing their true nature. Stories began circulating that portrayed the family as protectors of ancient wisdom and guardians against supernatural threats. These tales, spread through a network of storytellers and traveling merchants who had been influenced by Hatfield products, created a cultural narrative that made questioning the family's activities seem not just dangerous, but morally wrong. Local legends spoke of Hatfield family members appearing in times of crisis to provide aid and guidance, always at a price that seemed reasonable until it was too late to reverse the bargain. These stories followed consistent patterns. Individuals or communities would face insurmountable challenges. A mysterious stranger bearing resemblance to known Hatfield family members would offer assistance, and the resulting solution would create long-term obligations that gradually consumed the beneficiary's independence. The medical community began documenting unusual phenomena in areas with significant Hatfield presence. Physicians reported treating patients with symptoms that didn't correspond to any known diseases, including progressive changes in eye color, enhanced physical strength accompanied by increased aggression, and the development of additional sensory capabilities that seem to operate beyond normal human limitations. Most concerning were the reports of patients who claimed to receive medical guidance through dreams, following treatment protocols that had never been formally prescribed, but which proved remarkably effective for their conditions. Dr. Elizabeth Hartford, who established a practice in Huntington, West Virginia in 1903, documented over 200 cases of what she termed environmental adaptation syndrome among patients who had extended exposure to Hatfield-controlled territories. Her research, which was suppressed by medical authorities and only discovered decades later, described systematic changes in human physiology that appeared to be triggered by prolonged contact with Hatfield influence. The transportation networks that connected Hatfield territories began exhibiting unusual characteristics during this period. Travelers reported that journeys through these areas took less time than expected, as if distances had somehow been compressed. Maps of the region became increasingly unreliable, with roads and landmarks shifting positions between different surveys. Most disturbing were the accounts of travelers who became lost in areas they knew well, wandering for hours or days before emerging with no clear memory of their experience, but carrying messages or packages they couldn't explain. The railroad lines that served Hatfield Industries experienced their own anomalies. Train schedules that should have been impossible to maintain were kept with perfect precision, and locomotives could carry loads that exceeded their rated capacity without mechanical stress. Railroad workers reported that trips through Hatfield territory were accompanied by strange sounds, lights visible in areas where no settlements existed, and the sensation of being observed by unseen watchers. Some engineers claimed that their trains would occasionally accelerate beyond the capabilities of their engines, as if being pulled by an external force. As the 1890s drew to a close, the Hatfield family had successfully transformed from an isolated mountain clan into a regional power with influence extending across multiple states. Their combination of legitimate business success, supernatural abilities, and strategic manipulation had created a network of control that operated largely beneath the notice of federal authorities. The approaching 20th century would bring new challenges and opportunities, but the foundation they had established during this decade of expansion would prove remarkably durable. The The true scope of Hatfield influence during this period remained hidden from contemporary observers, but the evidence of their activities left lasting marks on the regions they controlled. Communities that had experienced Hatfield presence during the 1890s would continue to exhibit unusual characteristics for generations, as if the family's influence had become permanently embedded in the spiritual landscape of Appalachia. The winter of 1902 brought with it more than just the usual bone-chilling cold that settled into the hollows of West Virginia. That December, something else descended upon the mountain communities surrounding the Hatfield compound, something that would forever alter the delicate balance between the natural and supernatural worlds that the family had so carefully maintained for nearly 8 decades. Local residents began reporting strange phenomena that seemed to radiate outward from Devil Anse Hatfield's territory, like ripples from a stone thrown into dark water. Livestock would be found standing motionless in perfect circles, their eyes reflecting an unnatural silver light even in broad daylight. Children spoke of hearing voices calling their names from empty rooms, voices that sounded exactly like deceased relatives, but carried an underlying tone that made their parents lock doors and draw curtains tight. The most disturbing reports came from the handful of travelers brave enough to venture through the mountain passes near Hatfield land. They described encountering figures on the trails who appeared completely normal from a distance, but as these travelers drew closer, they realized the figures cast no shadows despite the bright winter sun. When approached, these shadowless beings would simply vanish, leaving behind only the faint scent of sulfur and something else, something organic and decay-sweet that reminded witnesses of flowers left too long on a grave. What these outsiders didn't understand was that they were witnessing the fruits of Ephraim Hatfield's most ambitious ritual yet, a working that had taken him 3 years to prepare and would fundamentally transform not just his family's capabilities, but their very nature. Deep within the blood chamber, carved into the living rock beneath the family compound, Ephraim had spent those 3 years inscribing symbols that covered every surface of the circular room. These weren't the crude markings of earlier rituals, but an intricate network of interconnected designs that seemed to shift and writhe when viewed by lamplight, as though the stone itself had become a living thing. The symbols told a story, though not one that any conventional scholar would recognize. They depicted the gradual merging of two worlds, the realm of flesh and blood, where ordinary humans lived and died, and something else, a place where consciousness could exist without physical form, where thoughts became tangible and will alone could reshape reality. Ephraim had discovered references to this other realm in the most ancient of the texts he'd acquired over the decades, manuscripts written in languages that predated any known civilization in the Americas. According to these forbidden writings, there were specific times when the barrier between worlds grew thin enough for those with the proper knowledge to create permanent bridges. The winter solstice of 1902 represented such an opportunity, but only if the ritual was performed with perfect precision and fueled by a sacrifice of unprecedented magnitude. For months, Ephraim had been gathering what he needed, not just the usual animal offerings that had sustained the family's previous workings, but something far more potent. He had spent the summer traveling to neighboring counties, using his reputation and influence to identify individuals who possessed what the ancient texts called the bright blood, people whose life force burned with unusual intensity. These weren't necessarily good people or evil ones, but those whose very existence seemed to generate an energy that others could sense, even if they couldn't name it. The charismatic preacher in Logan County who could heal the sick with a touch of his hands. The young woman in Mercer County whose dreams consistently predicted future events. The blacksmith near Charleston whose metalwork was so superior that competitors whispered he must have made a deal with dark forces. The elderly Cherokee medicine man who had refused to leave his ancestral lands despite decades of pressure, sustained by knowledge passed down through generations of spiritual tradition. One by one, through carefully orchestrated accidents, sudden illnesses, and mysterious disappearances, Ephraim had harvested what he needed from these individuals. Not their deaths, though several had indeed died, but something more precious, samples of their essence captured at the moment when their unique gifts were at their peak. A vial of the preacher's tears shed during his most powerful healing. Drops of blood from the dreaming woman collected while she slept and prophesied. Metal shavings from the blacksmith's forge, taken while he worked in what witnesses described as an almost trance-like state of creative fury. Sacred herbs blessed by the medicine man and stolen from his lodge during a ritual ceremony. These materials, along with contributions from every member of the Hatfield bloodline, were combined in a process that took place over the 7 nights leading up to the winter solstice. Each night, the family gathered in the blood chamber while Ephraim performed increasingly complex ceremonies that seemed to charge the very air with electricity. Family members reported that their skin tingled constantly during this period, that metal objects became warm to the touch in their presence, and that they could hear each other's thoughts as clearly as spoken words. Sarah Hatfield, Devil Ance's wife, kept a journal during those 7 nights, one of the few written records of what the family experienced during their most transformative ritual. Her entries, discovered decades later hidden behind a false wall in the main house, provide a chilling glimpse into the process that elevated the Hatfields from merely dangerous to something approaching supernatural. Night 1, she wrote, the symbols on the chamber walls began to glow with their own light, a deep red radiance that pulsed in rhythm with our heartbeats. Ephraim spoke words in the old tongue, and I felt something stir in my blood, as though serpents were swimming through my veins. The children's eyes reflected the red light like mirrors, and when they spoke, their voices harmonized in ways that human voices should not be able to achieve. By the 3rd night, the physical changes had begun. Family members found they could see clearly in complete darkness, their night vision surpassing even that of nocturnal predators. Their hearing became so acute they could distinguish individual conversations taking place in the valley below their mountain compound. Most remarkably, they discovered they could sense the emotional states of people at considerable distances, feeling the fear, anger, or desperation of anyone within several miles of their territory. Night 5 brought what Sarah described as the opening of the inner eye. Family members began experiencing shared visions, glimpses of events occurring in distant locations, and more disturbing previews of events that had not yet come to pass. They witnessed their enemies planning against them, saw law enforcement officials discussing raids on their property, and observed the secret activities of rival families throughout the region. This newfound prescience would prove invaluable in the years to come, allowing the Hatfields to stay always one step ahead of their adversaries. The final night, the winter solstice itself, brought the culmination of Ephraim's grand working. As midnight approached, every member of the family, from the youngest child to the eldest elder, took their assigned positions in the blood chamber. The accumulated materials from Ephraim's months of preparation were arranged in precise patterns around the room, each element placed according to calculations that had taken him years to perfect. What happened next defied every natural law. According to Sarah's final journal entry, written days later when she had recovered enough to hold a pen, the stone walls of the chamber became transparent, revealing not the mountain rock that surrounded them, but a vast space filled with swirling mists and distant lights. From this otherworldly vista emerged figures, beings that appeared to be made of shadow and starlight, entities that radiated both ancient wisdom and terrible hunger. These beings, which Ephraim addressed by names that hurt to hear spoken aloud, offered the family a bargain that went far beyond their previous supernatural arrangements. In exchange for serving as anchors between the two worlds, permanent conduits through which these entities could influence physical reality, the Hatfields would be granted abilities that would make them virtually unstoppable in their earthly endeavors. The price was transformation. No longer would they be entirely human, but something new, a hybrid existence that partook of both mortal flesh and otherworldly essence. They would retain their physical forms, but these bodies would become vessels for forces that operated according to different rules than those governing ordinary life and death. The family's acceptance was unanimous. One by one, each Hatfield stepped forward to seal the pact, allowing the shadow beings to touch them with appendages that felt like ice and fire simultaneously. The sensation, Sarah wrote, was of being turned inside out and reassembled, of having every cell in our bodies rewritten according to a new design. We remained ourselves, but ourselves enhanced, ourselves made more than human. When dawn broke on the winter solstice, the Hatfield family that emerged from the blood chamber was fundamentally different from the one that had entered 7 nights earlier. Their physical appearances had changed subtly but significantly. Their skin took on a faint luminescence in darkness. Their eyes reflected light with an intensity that made direct eye contact uncomfortable for normal humans, and their movements possessed a fluid grace that seemed to defy gravity. More importantly, their capabilities had expanded exponentially. They could now project their consciousness across vast distances, experiencing events as though physically present while their bodies remained safely within their mountain stronghold. They could influence the thoughts and emotions of others, not just through proximity, but through sheer force of will, planting suggestions and fears that would grow and multiply in their targets' minds like psychological viruses. Most remarkably, they had gained a form of collective immortality. While individual family members could still be killed, their essential selves, their memories and personalities would not be lost, but absorbed into the family's shared consciousness. Death became merely a transition from physical to spiritual existence within the clan structure, with deceased members continuing to contribute their knowledge and abilities to the family's supernatural arsenal. The immediate effects of this transformation were felt throughout the region. The Hatfield's enemies found themselves plagued by inexplicable misfortunes, accidents that seemed almost supernaturally targeted, and a growing sense of dread that made even thinking about opposing the family feel dangerous. Local wildlife began exhibiting strange behaviors, with predators refusing to hunt in certain areas and domestic animals displaying signs of intelligence that bordered on the uncanny. Government officials who had been planning raids on Hatfield territory found their efforts inexplicably stymied. Evidence would disappear from locked files, witnesses would recant their testimony, and investigators would suffer mysterious accidents that left them incapacitated but alive, carrying with them a bone-deep certainty that pursuing the Hatfield case further would result in consequences far worse than mere professional failure. The family's economic enterprises flourished beyond all reasonable expectation. Their moonshine developed a reputation that extended far beyond West Virginia, with customers claiming it produced not just intoxication, but enhanced perception and temporary psychic abilities. Their lumber operations discovered timber reserves that geological surveys insisted couldn't exist, while their mining ventures struck veins of coal so pure it burned with an almost supernatural heat. But perhaps the most significant change was in how the family related to their territory itself. The mountains, valleys, and waterways surrounding their compound began responding to their will as though the landscape had become an extension of their collective body. Trails would shift to confuse intruders, weather patterns would change to conceal family activities, and the very rocks and trees seemed to serve as an early warning system, alerting the Hatfields to any approaching threats. Local residents, those few who remained in the area, developed an instinctual avoidance of anything connected to the Hatfield name. Children would wake from nightmares featuring tall figures with glowing eyes who whispered promises and threats in equal measure. Adults found themselves taking longer routes to avoid passing near Hatfield property, often without consciously realizing they were doing so. The transformation also affected how the family reproduced and raised their children. Babies born after the winter solstice ritual were different from their older siblings, displaying abilities from birth that had taken their parents years to develop. These children could communicate telepathically before they learned to speak aloud, could see and interact with the shadow beings that served as the family's otherworldly allies, and seemed to possess an intuitive understanding of the supernatural forces that now governed their existence. As 1903 dawned, the Hatfield family had successfully evolved from a clan of dangerous but essentially human outlaws into something that challenged the very categories of natural and supernatural. They had become living bridges between worlds, entities that existed simultaneously in the realm of flesh and blood and in dimensions where thought and will were the primary forces shaping reality. This transformation would prove to be the foundation for everything that followed in their dark legacy, the source of powers that would allow them to not just survive, but thrive as the world around them changed and modernized. They had transcended the limitations of mortality while retaining enough humanity to understand and manipulate the desires and fears that drove ordinary people. As the 1800s progressed, the Hatfield bloodline had evolved into something far more sinister than mere mountain outlaws. What began as strategic supernatural bargaining had transformed into a systematic campaign of regional domination that would span generations. The winter of 1887 marked a turning point when Ephraim Hatfield, now possessed of abilities that defied natural law, initiated what family records would later call the Great Convergence. By this time, the Hatfield children born from the cursed unions displayed capabilities that terrified even their own kin. These weren't simply psychic gifts or enhanced physical traits anymore. Third generation Hatfield offspring could manipulate the very fabric of reality within their territorial boundaries. Young Levacy Hatfield, barely 14, could cause livestock to sicken and die simply by staring at them while concentrating on their life force draining away. Her brother Constantine possessed the ability to project his consciousness across vast distances, witnessing events in neighboring counties as though he stood invisible among the participants. The family's underground chambers had expanded into a vast network of interconnected caverns stretching beneath half of Logan County. These weren't crude dugouts anymore, but sophisticated ritual spaces carved with symbols that seemed to shift and writhe when observed directly. The walls themselves pulsed with a faint luminescence that grew brighter during the dark moon phases when the family conducted their most powerful ceremonies. What made the Hatfields particularly dangerous during this period was their systematic approach to expanding their supernatural influence. They began targeting specific bloodlines throughout Appalachia, not for elimination, but for corruption. Ephraim had discovered that certain family lines possessed latent psychic potential that could be awakened through carefully orchestrated trauma and ritual exposure. The process was methodical and cruel. Hatfield operatives would identify families with the proper genetic markers, usually revealed through their ability to sense supernatural activity or their unusually long lifespans. These families would then be subjected to a campaign of escalating misfortune. Crops would fail mysteriously, livestock would disappear, children would experience vivid nightmares featuring shadowy figures offering solutions to their family's problems. When desperation reached its peak, a Hatfield representative would appear offering assistance. Never identifying themselves as Hatfields, these emissaries posed as traveling merchants, itinerant preachers, or distant relatives. They would provide exactly what the family needed: money, medicine, protection from whatever supernatural harassment they'd been experiencing. The price, they explained, was simple participation in a single ceremony to ensure the family's continued prosperity. These ceremonies took place in neutral locations, often abandoned churches or natural clearings that the Hatfields had spent decades preparing with their ritual workings. The targeted families would arrive expecting a simple blessing or prosperity ritual. Instead, they found themselves participants in blood-binding ceremonies that linked their life force permanently to the Hatfield collective consciousness. The transformation wasn't immediate. Families who underwent these rituals would return home believing they'd simply participated in an unusual but harmless mountain tradition. Over the following months, however, the changes would manifest. Family members would begin experiencing shared dreams where they received instructions for tasks that seemed unrelated to their daily lives. They might be told to plant specific crops in particular patterns, to dig wells in locations that made no practical sense, or to leave offerings at certain landmarks during specific lunar phases. What these families didn't realize was that they were becoming components in a vast supernatural network spanning hundreds of square miles. Each family served as a node in a web of psychic energy that the Hatfields could tap into at will. When the family collectively focused their intentions, they could draw upon the life force and spiritual energy of dozens of bound bloodlines, amplifying their own abilities exponentially. This network proved invaluable during the infamous Hatfield-McCoy feud, though historical accounts never recognized the true nature of the conflict. While newspapers portrayed it as a simple mountain grudge match over stolen pigs and romantic entanglements, the reality was far more complex. The McCoys had somehow discovered the extent of Hatfield's supernatural activities and had begun organizing resistance among the affected families. Randolph McCoy wasn't simply a stubborn mountain patriarch nursing a grudge. He was one of the few individuals in the region who possessed natural immunity to Hatfield psychic manipulation, likely due to his own family's ancient protective traditions. When he began investigating the strange changes in neighboring families, he uncovered evidence of the binding rituals and the systematic exploitation of local bloodlines. The feud escalated when McCoy attempted to break the supernatural bonds holding these families in thrall. He gathered a group of like-minded individuals who had retained their independence and began conducting counter-rituals designed to sever the psychic connections. These efforts proved partially successful, weakening the Hatfield network and causing several bound families to regain their free will. Ephraim Hatfield's response was swift and merciless. Using the collective power of his remaining network, he launched a campaign of supernatural terrorism against the McCoys and their allies. Family members reported being attacked by shadow creatures that left no physical evidence. Their livestock died from mysterious ailments that no veterinarian could diagnose. Their children experienced possession episodes where they would speak in voices that weren't their own, delivering threats in languages no one recognized. The physical violence that historians documented was merely the visible manifestation of this supernatural war. When Hatfield gunmen surrounded the McCoy cabin on New Year's night, 1888, they weren't acting alone. The attack was coordinated with a massive ritual conducted simultaneously in the underground chambers, designed to break the McCoy family's spiritual defenses and leave them vulnerable to both physical and psychic assault. The burning of the McCoy home served a dual purpose. Beyond eliminating physical opposition, the flames were fueled by materials that had been prepared in advance through ritual processes. As the structure burned, it released energies that would curse the land itself, ensuring that any future attempts to rebuild or reestablish resistance would fail. What made this period particularly horrifying was the Hatfield family's evolution beyond human limitations. By 1890, several family members had achieved what their records called the final transformation. These individuals no longer required physical bodies to maintain their consciousness. They existed as pure psychic entities that could inhabit multiple forms simultaneously. Ephraim Hatfield himself underwent this transformation in 1891, though his death wasn't recorded in any official documents. His physical body simply ceased to be relevant as his consciousness expanded to inhabit the entire network of bound families. Witnesses reported encountering him in multiple locations simultaneously, appearing as a tall figure in dark clothing who seemed to flicker in and out of visibility. The most disturbing aspect of this transformation was its hereditary nature. Hatfield children born after 1890 came into the world already partially transformed. They possessed the ability to exist in multiple states of being simultaneously, appearing as normal children to casual observers while manifesting as supernatural entities when their true nature was required. These transformed offspring served as the family's primary agents for expanding their influence beyond Appalachia. They could travel freely throughout the country, establishing satellite networks in major cities where they would identify and corrupt individuals with psychic potential. By the turn of the century, the Hatfield network extended from Boston to San Francisco, with dozens of subsidiary families bound to their will. The family's business enterprises during this period served as fronts for their supernatural activities. Their mining operations weren't simply extracting coal, but were accessing subterranean energy sources that fed their ritual workings. The timber companies weren't just harvesting wood, but were systematically clearing sacred groves that had previously protected certain regions from supernatural influence. Their moonshine operations incorporated ingredients that had been prepared through ritual processes, creating alcoholic beverages that served as delivery systems for minor enchantments. Regular consumers would gradually develop psychic sensitivity that made them more susceptible to Hatfield influence. Tavern keepers throughout the region unknowingly served as recruitment agents, identifying individuals who showed signs of supernatural awareness after consuming the doctored liquor. The railroad expansion of the 1890s provided new opportunities for the Hatfield network to spread their influence. They established relationships with construction crews, ensuring that rail lines were routed through locations that served their strategic interests. Certain railroad bridges and tunnels were constructed according to specifications that incorporated ritual geometries, creating transportation corridors that facilitated the movement of supernatural energies across vast distances. By 1900, the Hatfield family had achieved something unprecedented in American history. They had created a shadow government that operated through supernatural means rather than political institutions. Their network controlled vast swaths of territory, not through legal ownership, but through psychic domination of the human populations. They could influence elections, manipulate markets, and eliminate opposition without leaving any evidence that conventional law enforcement could recognize. The true scope of their power became apparent during the labor unrest of the early 1900s. When mining companies faced strikes and worker organizing efforts, Hatfield operatives would appear to offer assistance to both sides of the conflict. They would provide funding to strike organizers while simultaneously offering strike-breaking services to company owners. Their goal wasn't to resolve the disputes, but to escalate them, creating chaos that could be exploited to expand their influence over both labor and management. The violence that erupted during these conflicts served the family's supernatural purposes. They had discovered that mass casualties, particularly when occurring in locations they had prepared through ritual workings, generated tremendous amounts of psychic energy that could be harvested and stored for future use. Mining disasters, factory explosions, and labor violence weren't accidents, but carefully orchestrated events designed to feed the family's ever-growing hunger for power. As the new century dawned, the Hatfield bloodline had evolved into something that challenged the very concepts of human identity and natural law. They existed simultaneously as individuals and as a collective consciousness, as physical beings and as spiritual entities, as American citizens, and as something far older and more dangerous than any government could contain or control. The accumulated power of the Hatfield bloodline by the turn of the 20th century had transformed them into something that defied conventional understanding of human influence. Their supernatural abilities, once confined to the misty hollows of Appalachia, began extending tentacles of control across the expanding American landscape. But true dominion, they understood, required more than regional influence. It demanded complete integration into the very fabric of the nation's developing infrastructure. The discovery came through young Cornelius Hatfield in 1899, a prodigy who possessed an unprecedented connection to the family's collective consciousness. During a ritual beneath the compound, he experienced visions that revealed the true scope of their destiny. The ancient entities that had first empowered the clan were not merely local spirits bound to Appalachian soil, but fragments of something far more vast and primordial, something that had been waiting centuries for the right vessel to achieve total manifestation in the material world. The visions showed Cornelius networks of energy flowing beneath the earth, connecting every significant population center across the continent. These were not ley lines or mystical pathways as folklore might suggest, but actual conduits of human consciousness, created by the collective thoughts and emotions of millions of people. The Hatfields realized they could tap into these networks, but only if they established physical presence at key convergence points. This revelation triggered what the family privately called the Great Expansion. Between 1900 and 1920, Hatfield descendants began appearing in major cities across America, always settling in specific locations that Cornelius had identified through his supernatural cartography. They established themselves as respected businessmen, influential politicians, and prominent citizens, but their true purpose was far more sinister. Each new Hatfield settlement included a carefully constructed ritual space, always built directly above what they called convergence points. These underground chambers were connected through a network of sympathetic magic that allowed the family's collective consciousness to flow freely across vast distances. A ritual performed in New York could instantly affect operations in San Francisco. A sacrifice made in Chicago could empower activities in New Orleans. The family's influence grew exponentially through what they termed psychic capitalism. They discovered that human desires and fears, when properly channeled, could be transformed into actual power. By establishing businesses that catered to people's deepest needs, they created continuous streams of emotional energy that fed their supernatural abilities. Hatfield owned banks that preyed on desperate borrowers. Hatfield controlled newspapers that manipulated public opinion. Hatfield operated entertainment venues that harvested the raw emotional responses of audiences. Most insidious was their development of what they called breeding programs. The family had learned that their supernatural abilities could be passed to non-Hatfield bloodlines through specific rituals involving marriage and conception. But these weren't traditional marriages. They were carefully orchestrated unions designed to create hybrid offspring who carried diluted but still potent versions of the family's abilities while remaining completely unaware of their true nature. These unknowing descendants were strategically placed throughout American society. They became judges whose legal decisions were subtly influenced by inherited compulsions, military officers whose tactical choices served mysterious purposes, teachers whose lessons contained hidden psychological triggers, scientists whose research inadvertently advanced the family's goals, business leaders whose economic decisions channeled wealth and resources toward Hatfield enterprises. The hybrid bloodlines created what the family called the invisible network, thousands of individuals who felt inexplicable loyalties to people they'd never met, who made decisions based on impulses they couldn't explain, who experienced dreams that weren't their own. These people lived normal lives, raised families, pursued careers, and died natural deaths, never knowing they were instruments of a supernatural conspiracy that spanned generations. By 1920, the Hatfield influence had become so pervasive that they could manipulate major historical events through seemingly minor interventions. A word whispered to the right politician, a document placed in the wrong hands, a business deal that appeared coincidental but was orchestrated years in advance. They didn't need to control everything directly. They had learned to nudge events in directions that served their ultimate purpose. The family's greatest achievement during this period was their infiltration of the emerging entertainment industry. They understood that mass media represented an unprecedented opportunity to influence human consciousness on a scale never before possible. Hatfield descendants established themselves in Hollywood, New York's theater district, and the nascent radio industry, not as obvious power brokers, but as behind-the-scenes figures who shaped content in subtle but profound ways. Movies produced by Hatfield-influenced studios contained subliminal imagery that primed audiences for specific emotional responses. Radio programs included carefully crafted sound frequencies that created subconscious receptivity to particular ideas. Theater productions featured performers who had been trained to project psychological influence through methods that appeared to be merely exceptional acting ability. The cumulative effect was a gradual reshaping of American culture itself. Popular entertainment began reflecting themes that served the family's goals, normalizing concepts that would have been rejected as horrific in previous generations. Stories that portrayed supernatural influence as romantic rather than terrifying. Narratives that suggested individual will was less important than collective destiny. Characters who found fulfillment through submission to mysterious higher powers. But perhaps their most audacious achievement was their infiltration of the developing scientific community. Hatfield descendants pursued careers in emerging fields like psychology, sociology, and anthropology, using their positions to steer research in directions that validated their practices while disguising their true nature. They funded studies that dismissed supernatural phenomena as psychological delusions while simultaneously developing more sophisticated methods of psychic manipulation. The family established what they called Institutes of Human Potential in major universities, research centers that appeared to study human consciousness and behavior for humanitarian purposes. In reality, these institutes were laboratories where the Hatfields refined their understanding of mass psychological control. They developed techniques for influencing large populations through carefully orchestrated social movements, economic pressures, and cultural shifts. Their research revealed that human consciousness was far more malleable than most people realized. Under the right conditions, entire populations could be guided toward specific beliefs and behaviors without ever recognizing they were being manipulated. The key was patience and subtlety, changes so gradual that each generation accepted them as natural evolution rather than artificial influence. The Hatfield Network began implementing what they called century projects, long-term initiatives designed to reshape American society over multiple generations. These weren't dramatic takeovers or obvious conspiracies, but patient cultural engineering that would eventually create a population naturally inclined toward acceptance of supernatural authority. They influenced educational curricula to emphasize collectivism over individualism. They shaped religious movements to stress submission to mysterious divine will rather than personal relationship with comprehensible deity. They guided political developments toward systems that concentrated power in institutions rather than individuals. They steered economic policies toward models that created dependence rather than independence. The results were already becoming apparent by the 1920s. Americans were increasingly willing to accept guidance from experts and authorities rather than trusting their own judgment. Communities were becoming more atomized, with individuals feeling isolated and seeking belonging through mass movements rather than personal relationships. Traditional sources of meaning, like family, religion, and local community, were being replaced by abstract loyalties to distant institutions and causes. But the Hatfields understood that their greatest triumph was still to come. The massive social disruptions of the 20th century, the wars, economic collapses, and cultural upheavals that lay ahead, would create unprecedented opportunities for their kind of influence. Chaos and fear made populations desperate for stability and meaning, willing to accept guidance from any source that promised security. They had positioned themselves perfectly for these coming crises. Their network of influenced individuals was embedded throughout American society. Their understanding of mass psychology had been refined through decades of research and experimentation. Their supernatural abilities had been amplified through the emotional energy of millions of unknowing contributors. Their long-term projects had already begun reshaping the cultural landscape. Most importantly, they had learned to hide in plain sight. The Hatfield name had become synonymous with quaint Appalachian folklore rather than supernatural threat. Their actual operations were conducted through layers of legitimate businesses, academic institutions, and civic organizations. Their influence was exercised through subtle nudges rather than obvious control. The ancient entities that had first empowered their bloodline were no longer confined to mountain hollows. They had found hosts throughout the American landscape, embedded in the consciousness of a growing network of human vessels. The boundary between the Hatfield family and the broader population was becoming increasingly blurred as their influence spread through bloodlines, institutions, and cultural patterns. As the 20th century progressed, the question was no longer whether the Hatfields would achieve their ultimate goal of complete dominion over American society. The question was whether anyone would recognize what was happening before it was too late to resist. The transformation they had begun was designed to be irreversible, creating a population that would eventually welcome supernatural authority as liberation rather than recognize it as enslavement. The mountains of Appalachia still held their secrets, but those secrets were no longer confined to remote hollows. As we close this dark chapter, the truth becomes chillingly clear. The Hatfields never simply vanished into history, they evolved. Today, their descendants walk among us, occupying boardrooms, government offices, and media conglomerates. That unexplained promotion you witnessed, that politician who seemed to rise from nowhere, that media narrative that felt strangely compelling, these may not be coincidences. The ancient entities that first empowered Ephraim Hatfield have achieved something far more terrifying than regional control. They've woven themselves into the very fabric of modern civilization. Every technological advancement, every social movement, every cultural shift bears traces of their influence. The smart devices in our homes, the algorithms that shape our thoughts, the infrastructure that connects our world, all serve as conduits for their supernatural network. What began as a desperate mountain family's bargain with darkness has become humanity's invisible cage. We live our lives believing we make our own choices, never suspecting that our desires, our fears, our very thoughts are being subtly guided by forces that predate human civilization. The Hatfields succeeded beyond their wildest ambitions. They didn't just gain power over their enemies, they gained power over reality itself. The most disturbing revelation is that we've become willing participants in our own manipulation. We embrace the technologies that monitor us, consume the media that programs us, and celebrate the progress that enslaves us. The supernatural has become so seamlessly integrated with the natural that we can no longer distinguish between them. Tonight, as you drift off to sleep, remember that somewhere in the shadows, the Hatfield legacy continues its patient work. The mountains of Appalachia may seem distant, but their influence reaches into every corner of our modern world. The ancient darkness that once dwelled in those misty hollows and now pulses through fiber optic cables, broadcasts through radio waves, and whispers through the digital networks that connect every aspect of our lives. The Hatfields achieved immortality not through their bloodline, but through their corruption of human civilization itself. They became the invisible architects of our modern nightmare, and we, their unwitting subjects, dance to melodies we cannot hear, following paths we did not choose, toward a destiny we cannot imagine.